Oh, 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 What's happening, fantasy world? It's your boy Hot Soup, and I'm here to give you our overachievers for week 14. We got some hot shit, man. We're gonna talk about it. Overachievers in week 14, man. We had a lot of good football going on. What we also had in week 14 is when we think we know what we talking about, we don't. All those fantasy owners out there that were in high stock value players, and we started those guys, got a rude awakening in week 14. All those guys that were on waiver wires that people was like, man, I don't need them. I don't need them. My team's tough. It's stacked. All those waiver wire players, man, went off in week 14, man. It was crazy. And we about to talk about it. Yeah. Our first player on our overachiever list, and I had to put this guy on there because he was the number one quarterback in fantasy football in week 14, was Josh Allen. Listen, Josh Allen beat the brakes off LA by himself. Okay. No, it was actually a good game, man. He didn't beat the brakes off. We seen the game, hell of a game, back and forth, scoring affair. But Josh Allen goes out and puts up 424 yards, 6 touchdowns. That man beat that team by himself. Cook wasn't even a factor in the game. It was crazy, man. 51.88 points. If you had Josh Allen this week, you won your week. If you did not win your week and you had Josh Allen this week, your team is garbage. Number 2, quarterback in fantasy football this week went to Sam Darnold, man. And Sam Darnold not only threw for over 300 yards, 354 to be exact. That man threw for 5 touchdowns, 34.58 points. Number 2 fantasy scoring quarterback, and he was a waiver wire pickup earlier in the season. That's right, man. So when you draft in next year, and you're like, man, I got to get a quarterback. I got to get it. Man, you can get a nice quarterback off the waiver wire. It happens year in and year out. When it comes to fantasy football, if you know, you know. Our first running back off the board for overachievers this week was on the waiver wire. And as a matter of fact, we thought Kenneth Walker was going to play. And it came down to a game time decision. This guy was not playing. We found out Sunday morning early and went out and picked up Charbonnet, and he ended up the number 1 running back in fantasy scoring in week 14. Yo, that's crazy. Zach Charbonnet versus Arizona, 29 touches, 193 yards, and 2 touchdowns. He is better than Kenneth Walker when he subs in for Kenneth Walker. It is what it is. He has put up huge numbers in the 3 starts that he's had when Kenneth Walker has been out in 2024. That's a guy teams might be wanting to shoot for. Yeah, man, make a trade. Listen, 34.8 fantasy points, the number 1 fantasy running back in week 14. Our second running back, Isaac Guerendo, also was on the waiver wires as of recent. Had to pick him up because of the CMC injury, and he did not disappoint. Versus Chicago, had 17 touches, 128 yards, and 2 touchdowns. I also had him on my top 5 starts last week. You should have been watching. Isaac Guerendo, 128 yards, 2 TDs, 25.8 fantasy points, the number 2 overall running back in week 14. And our number 3 running back, Rachaad White. Rachaad White ends up with 19 touches versus Las Vegas and turns 109 yards and 3 touchdowns. They're giving that man the rock in the red zone. He ended up with 23.9 fantasy points. What's even better for Rachaad White owners is Bucky Irving is injured and did not get much work in this game. So going into the playoffs, for all of those who had Bucky Irving thinking that he was going to have you set sailed and rocking through the playoffs, man, Rachaad White could be your guy. All right, our number 1 receiver. Ooh, put up a game on Monday night. Jamar Chase. This name has been ringing week in and week out. Number one overall versus Dallas, 14 receptions, 191 yards, and 2 touchdowns, a game winning touchdown at the end on a one move. All he did was turn inside and took it to the house. He's done it a numerous times this year. He is the best receiver in the NFL when the ball is in his hands. I was just talking to a colleague of mine about how Jamar Chase has put up all this yak yards after catch. Jamar Chase very rarely catches these deep balls. He's getting these 5-yard hitches, making one cut on the corner and taking it to the house up the sideline. I've seen it happen numerous times this year. 5-yard slants, 5-yard outs, hitches to the house, screens to the house. This guy is the man with the ball in his hand. That's all they got to do. And did they get the ball in his hand? 14 receptions. They know how to win a game. It is what it is, man. Jamar Chase, shouts out to that guy. I got your jersey on the way. Yes, that's right. Next episode, y'all see me with the green boy on, man. Salute to service. I got the green Jamar Chase jersey on the way. We're going to talk about it. Our number 2 receiver this week was Puka Nacua. Ooh, he had a game, and he had one of the greatest sideline toe catches I've seen in a long time. Puka Nacua versus Buffalo ends up with 12 receptions, 178 yards, and 2 touchdowns. Good for 35.8 fantasy points. Shouts out to Puka. Shouts out to the Rams. Shouts out to Stafford. Cup. What they got going on in that passing game is business, and they standing on it. Our number 3 receiver, Jordan Addison. Jordan Addison had a day, ended up with 8 receptions, 133 yards, and 3 tutties. That's right. His 3 tutties, 133 yards and 8 receptions got him 35.3 fantasy points. Ends up the number 3 overall receiver in week 14. And what we're going to talk about next is our tight ends. Now, the tight ends did not have a good week in week 14. These tight ends are scoring 13 and 12 points, and they're number 3 and 4. That's right. Our number 3 tight end was Jawan Johnson. Shouts out to my boy, the Johnson family. That's right, man. Little George, Big George. That's Jawan's uncle and Jawan's nephew, man. I know him well. Little George ran on my track team, man. Hell of an athlete, man. They got lineage. It runs in the family, man. Dad played for the New Orleans Saints as well. Man, I'm telling you. First New York Giants, 4 receptions, 50 yards, and a touchdown this week. 13 fantasy points. Shouts out to Jawan, man. Keep rocking. Our number 2 tight end, Pat Fryermuth versus Cleveland. Went off for 3 receptions, 48 yards, and a touchdown. Good for 12.3 fantasy points. That's the number 4 overall tight end in fantasy scoring. That's right. Tight ends are going to have better days. They had a bad week. But look, tight end isn't really a high priority position, and this shows us why. Those are our top 10 overachievers for week 14. Now we're going to talk about our underachievers for week 14. Let's get greasy. Woo, greasy. Will Levis, number 1. Will Levis going against the worst secondary in the league. He was supposed to have a big day. Ended up getting injured, but came back into the game in the second half. Will Levis had me sick. I started him in 2 or 3 of my leagues, even though I was in the fantasy playoffs in those leagues. You know, I was just messing around just to see what he was going to do, thinking, hey, man, let me go get a sleeper, throw him in. He'll throw up 28, 30 points for me, and I'll be looking like a guru. Man, I'm looking like a whole damn fool. Will Levis, 171 yards, 0 touchdowns, 0 picks, ends up with 7.02 fantasy points, the number 26 overall. 26 overall quarterback. Man, I could have picked 25 better options than your sorry ass. But it's all good, man. Will Levis has been dropped for the fantasy playoffs. Our number 2 quarterback that we're going to talk about, Geno Smith. Geno Smith, man, he's been a model of consistency. This week, he was a consistent low floor play. 233 yards, 1 touchdown, good for 13.32 fantasy points. Ends up number 21 overall in fantasy scoring for quarterbacks. Man, we had 6 teams on a bye week. Oh, that means it was only 26 teams playing. This man was number 21 overall. Terrible, terrible, terrible week. Our number 1 running back in underachievers this week, Bucky Irving. Now, Bucky had a little ankle issue, but he ended up only getting about 6, 7 touches. He had a little ankle issue, ended up with only 5 touches, 18 yards for 2.3 fantasy points. How confident are you in Bucky going into the fantasy playoffs with those type of numbers, knowing Rachaad White ends up with over 100 yards and 3 TDs? Bucky, thank you for getting us to the fantasy playoffs. Rachaad White has arrived. He was number 49 overall in fantasy scoring this week. He's going to have better days, but it is what it is. Our second running back off the board. Oh, and this one hurt, especially since the Bills put up so many points. James Cook, the running back, only had 8 touches, 29 yards. He has plenty of games where he is under 40 and 50 yards this year. He's either explode or a flop week in and week out. 3.9 fantasy points for James Cook, ends up number 38 overall. There was only 26 teams playing this week. You do the math yourself. Our next guy that I told y'all to get on your bench in my top 5 sits last week was Isaiah Pacheco. Look, they're getting him acclimated. He's going to get touches, but he's not going to get all the touches. Kareem Hunt is still eating into that workload. They're not going to give him all those touches until they feel like he is fully healthy. They're trying to win in the playoffs. And we're not talking fantasy playoffs. We're talking about the real NFL playoffs. I'm shy and I stay away from that type of productivity if I see it going into the fantasy playoffs. You got to go with guys that have a high floor. All right. So Isaiah Pacheco ends up with 16 touches, 61 yards, 7.1 fantasy points, ends up 31 overall. And once again, there were only 26 teams, 13 games this week. It is what it is. I was right. Yeah. Our number 1 receiver that was a bust this week, Deebo Samuel. Deebo Samuel ends up with 7 receptions, 35 yards, ends up 4.5 fantasy points. However, Brock Purdy looked great. Deebo will have better days. Just as I said, as soon as CMC went out, Deebo would get more carries, and he did. Half his touches were runs. Hey, man, it's going to continue to be like that down the stretch. Hopefully, you guys got better options. I'm not saying Deebo is going to be a league winner. That's all I'm saying. Hey, A.J. Brown, our next receiver. A.J. Brown, 4 receptions, 43 yards, 6.3 fantasy points. Shit, Hurts only had 100-something yards passing. He was running that rock. Tush push. Let the defense win the game. We never know what it's going to be with Philly. Hey, Saquon Barkley didn't even have a big game, but Hurts on the ground did his thing. 2 tush pushes and a touchdown through the air, 100-plus yards. Man, it's frustrating over there for Philly receivers. It's also frustrating for Barkley with Hurts taking all the tush pushes. You don't know what you're going to get week in and week out, man. But we do know the Eagles have a high-scoring offense, so we got to play them. Our next, A.J. Brown ended up number 47 overall in fantasy scoring in week 14. DK Metcalf was our next receiver, 4 receptions, 49 yards. DK has been a shell of himself. I don't know if it's because of the DK Metcalf has been a shell of himself. I don't know if the fuck. DK Metcalf has been a shell of himself. I don't know if it's because the injury or what's going on with DK and that offense over there, but they have not been hitting on nothing. Seattle, everybody wants to start their defense against Seattle. Listen, Geno Smith not putting up them numbers he's supposed to. We got 2 players from Seattle on this list, underachievers, and it's in the passing game, not the running game. DK Metcalf ends up with 6.9 fantasy points, number 45 overall in fantasy scoring for receivers in week 14. TJ Hawkinson, our first tight end off the board, ends up number 17 overall with 4 receptions, 45 yards, 6.5 fantasy points. I expect more, especially since Sam Darnold threw 5 touchdown passes, 350 yards. Man, TJ Hawkinson, you got to do better. Our number 10 player, number 2 tight end, Brock Bowers. He flopped. We're expecting 100 plus yards out of Brock Bowers, at least 8 receptions. This guy got 3 receptions, 52 yards. O'Connell got hurt. Offense looked terrible. 6.7 fantasy points in week 14, number 16 overall. Brock Bowers is going to have better days. You cannot bench him in the fantasy playoffs. Those are our top 10 underachievers for week 14. Come check us out for our top 5 starts, top 5 sits later on this week. Also, come check us out on our episode, I Told You So. We're going to go over our top 5 starts and our top 5 sits from week 14 and see how we fared off. Yeah, it's your boy Hot Soup. Check me out on Instagram, TikTok, YouTube. Like and subscribe. And you can get into them comments. Let's talk about it. Yeah, let's talk about it. Yeah, let's talk about it.